Thanks very much, Andy. I think one of the most interesting conversations I've had already here today, or one of the most interesting conversation starters, is to ask people how they came to be here. Whatever capacity they're here in, how they came to be here seems to have an interesting story behind it. So I'm going to start by saying how I came to be here. And Mark Earls, who I think he was here earlier, I don't know if he's still here. It's kind of his fault, really. There he is, yeah. So a few years back, I'm going to tell this story because actually it speaks to some of the points I'll be making as well. So a few years back, probably more than Andy or I care to remember, Mark was working in an agency, ad agency in London, and invited me to pitch for a workshop that he was going to be running with his department. Unbeknownst to me, he invited a chap on the west coast of Wales, Andy Middleton, to do the same. And when he looked at the two proposals, he had the inspired idea to shift competition to collaboration in one fell swoop and say, hey, you two guys might like to work together. And so we did. At the time, I was living in Madrid, and Andy was in St David's, and so we put together a workshop, and we met on the afternoon before the workshop in Islington. And Mark was there as well, and he agreed that we all agreed probably be sensible not to open the workshop or not to reveal the fact that Andy and I had only just met, as this might undermine the confidence of the group. Although we thought it might be interesting at the end of the day to reveal this, because the workshop was about collaboration and change, and so that seemed an interesting story. So Mark stood up, and first up, he said, you know, this workshop you're going to do today, these two guys, they're going to run it. They only met yesterday. So he kind of set us up for that, you know. And I just tell it because it's a really brave thing of him to do. And I think also it's to do with the fact that, you know, we can see things in different ways, and shifting competition into collaboration, that requires bravery. And I think, you know, that led to a whole series of relationships with Andy, who I've known for many years, and actually to my being here. So just in terms of affecting change, you know, how really small, simple changes can actually lead to all sorts of unforeseen consequences and results. So my life seems to have been dominated by that as well, by this sort of serendipitous factor. The work I do is with a little company I started, which is called On Your Feet. And it's located in Portland, Oregon, which is very convenient for somebody like myself who lives in rural Spain. We describe it as an adventure, a collaboration, and a mistake. It's an adventure because it's an open-ended journey, it's evolving and changing, and we don't know where it's going. It's a collaboration because it brings together the worlds of business and organizations on the one hand, and the arts on the other. And it's a mistake because it happened completely by accident. So I met a guy to talk about a T-shirt and ended up starting a little consulting business. So that business, the arts in particular that it works with, is improvisational theatre. And so what we've been doing for the last 12 years now is exploring how what actors know and actors who improvise know can be useful and interesting to people trying to create change in other places, in organizations, in businesses, in governments. So that's been our little adventure and exploration. Now, if you've never seen any improv theatre, which probably a bunch of you won't have done, don't worry, we'll rectify that in a few minutes. So we'll do a little bit together and you'll get the chance to see it. So we've got something here in the room to actually look at and kind of take to pieces and examine. Before we do that, I just want to talk a little bit about why I got interested in improv in the first place. My background is not in the theatre. Like Mark, I worked in advertising and in marketing in various different guises, funnily enough as a strategic planner. What happened was that I was kind of frustrated by the world in which I moved, the way that people described it, the kind of dominance of the need to explain rationally, lots of things that have been mentioned already today. And this actually had been a theme in my life as well. At university, I'd studied experimental psychology. I made the rather dumb assumption that that would have something with my experience of being a human being, and that proved to be completely false. It had quite a lot to do with neurons and synaptic gaps and something to do with rats, but not very much to do with my experience of being human. So I'd kind of been long frustrated by what I felt to be, if you like, the dominant discourse around us, the way things are explained, described, and the kind of ways that people set about doing things. And so I'd become very personally interested in complexity and living systems, which at least seemed to be addressing the kind of messy, mysterious world that I felt I lived in, that all sorts of chance happenings and strange twists and dead ends are kind of a vital part of it and make a lot of actually what I enjoy come to be. So I got very, very interested in this. And at the same time, I suppose as somebody who's just really trying to reclaim laziness as a virtue, I kind of thought there's got to be an easier way of doing things. There's got to be something which is less of a struggle, less of a push. You know, you can tell I'm pretty deeply lazy, having moved from a hard-working Protestant country like England to a nice laid-back Mediterranean one like Spain. So, you know, that was in the back of my mind as well. And these kind of two strands of my life came together when I met this chap, Gary Hirsch, who's my business partner, a very close friend now, to talk about this T-shirt. And as we were just introducing ourselves, as a T-shirt I'd bought, I was commissioning him to make one for a client. And he said, oh, by the way, I do that improv theatre thing. And I said, wow, that's amazing. You know, I've been a fan of Whose Line Is It Anyway for a very long time. And I just thought these people were prodigiously talented. And to be brutal, I was looking at this chap in front of me thinking, well, you don't look that talented. He knows this now, so he won't mind me saying that. And so he started to explain. I said, how do you do that? Just how do you do that? How do those people do that? And he said, oh, it's easy. Anybody can learn. There's a method. So I said, well, tell me more. And he started to unpack it. He started to talk about what that method comprised. And as he was speaking, I heard lots of the same ideas and patterns and concepts crop up that I'd been coming across in the world of science, in the world of complexity, of complex adaptive systems. And there was this amazing kind of coming together for me. And before that very first conversation finished, we had a piece of work. So I had a brief from a client. I thought this might fit. It did. We went on. We did it. We did 4 of them, and 12 years later we have a business. Not a very big one, but anyway, still going. So, so for me, it was not an interest in the theatre, but an interest in how things get done and how can you do things with more fun and more ease and more grace and more charm that really attracted me. So that was what kind of got me into it. And what I hope to do in the time that we've got is to just give you a few clues about things that I've learned that I think you can take from that world of the theatre and move into different spaces to help you get stuff done more easily and with a bit more fun along the way. So, enough of that. I want to actually do some improv right here, right now, just to bring it into the room. So Andy's going to help me a little bit, and hopefully some people at the front are going to help as well. The way, you're not going to have to do anything onerous or embarrassing. The way it works is like this. We're going to tell a story together, and I'll be the narrator of the story, okay? And what Andy's going to do is he's going to marshal your contribution, okay? So if you've got what I'd like you to do is to think of a word, those of you that are kind of at the front here, to think of a word that you'd like to hear in the story. And when you've got a word, any point, just raise your hand like this. And Andy, he will call upon you. He'll point to you or come up to you. And when he does, you shout out the word, and he may repeat it so that we can all hear. My job will then be to take that word, whatever it is, and use it in the story I am telling. Okay? So I'll give you one more piece of direction, which is to say, try and think of words that have as little or nothing to do with the story that I'm telling as possible, just to kind of make it, you know, a little bit more awkward for me. So I'm inviting you to think of words that have as little or nothing to do with the story. When you've got one, raise your hand. If Andy calls on you, shout it out. Andy will be listening to the story, and he'll be chucking in words. It's not a memory test for me. The ability to improvise has nothing to do with memory, and very little to do with talent, as you'll soon see. And so he will only give me a second word once I've used the first one, okay? And then we'll call it to a close, and then we'll kind of look at, well, what went on there? What did we do? Okay, so Andy, you clear on your role?
I am good.
Okay, those of you there can get thinking of some words that have nothing to do with the story. Now, in time-honoured fashion, we need a title as well. So what I'd like you to do, you've been in here for a few hours now, I'd like you to just look around the tent, look up, look down, and notice something you haven't really noticed yet. Could be an object, could be a colour, could be a sensation. Just look around and just notice something that you have yet to notice in here. Okay? And now what I'd like you to do, somebody to shout out a title for a story. So not a story that we know, like Alice in Wonderland, but a story we haven't heard before. Just a plain, simple, ordinary title. Shout one out, someone. The steering wheel?
The steering wheel on the ceiling.
The steering wheel on the ceiling, outstanding. Okay, so that's the title of our story, The Steering Wheel on the Ceiling. Andy, you ready to go?
Good.
And off we go. George was feeling a bit hungover.
Hedgehog.
He had a prickly sensation in the back of his spine, like a hedgehog had been in his bed. He thought to himself, this isn't good. He said, I'd much rather feel like a penguin diving in and out of the water and having fluid movements in my ideas. I've got to use my loaf. I've got to think of a new idea this morning, an idea that's going to conquer the world, that's going to change what we do and how we work.
Xylophone.
He went and did 15-minute xylophone practice because he always felt that that got him in the mood, and went down to the garden shed, and his awareness then was really concentrated on his problem.
Tinned tomatoes.
His shed was full of tinned tomatoes because he liked to be surrounded by fresh produce, and if he got hungry, then he could just snack in. He'd given up being a mooner and focused in his industry now on the automotive industry.
Gusset.
He had an unpleasant feeling in his gusset. This happened to him when a particularly big day was there. And so he thought to himself, I have to do something really radical. I'm just going to assassinate the way the car industry works. I'm going to change everything.
Sachin Tendulkar.
I'm going to be to the automotive industry what Sachin Tendulkar is to Indian cricket. And I've got a radical idea with which to do it. I'm going to put a tutu on first, because my hero is Eddie Izzard. And I just think more creative ideas will come to me if I'm dressed like Eddie Izzard.
Pottery.
And yes, when I've got my tutu on, I'll just do a little bit of pottery off on the side. Yeah, that's good, yes. I'm now back in my Eddie Izzard mode. And he came up with this idea of putting the carburettor where the steering wheel normally goes, and the steering wheel on the ceiling of the car, because he felt that this would enable people to look up and to be illuminated and to think about great things like the Colosseum while they were driving.
Last word.
It was just as well he'd had a vasectomy, because with a way of working like this,
defibrillator.
He probably was going to need, his clients were probably going to need a defibrillator to cope with the craziness of the ideas he'd come up with. The end. Very good. So that was something we made together. That wasn't something I did. And as I said earlier, I can assure you that requires no special talent. It does require one particular quality, which is that of being a human being. But most of us actually possess that. So it doesn't require any special talent. That doesn't mean to say there aren't people who are specially talented at performing on the improv stage. But the reason that it doesn't require any special talent is because that it's actually based on practice. It's based on practice, not on talent. And practice is obviously something you do and keep doing. It's not just good, just with practice, it's not good enough to just know something. Those craftsmen we were hearing about earlier, they have a practice, something they do and keep doing, and a talent and ability that they hone. Practice is also a discipline. And actually this practice of improvisation is based on a very simple practice, which you can sum up in these 6 words. So you have to be able to let go. I have to let go of where I think this story might be going in the example that we've just done. You have to let go of your hopes for my story. You yourselves, you have to notice more if you're going to think of words that have nothing to do with the story. The briefing, the priming, if you like, to look around the room was to just say, well, if you're trying to come up with stuff that has nothing to do with the story, you don't have to go into your head. What's there? Lean into your senses. Take and use what is there right in front of you. And you also have to be able to use everything that you're given, quite literally in this game. So that's the kind of summation of the improv practice at its simplest form. And it's very important that it's something you do and keep doing. And so improvisers, rather than preparing in detail to face a welter of circumstances they cannot possibly imagine in advance, simply practice doing these things over and over again, wherever they are, in whichever context they find themselves. So that's kind of how it looks. That dynamic that you saw in play there is probably a bit familiar to you. We often I feel like storytellers going through our lives with people throwing stuff at us that we have to kind of take and use. So there's a familiar dynamic there, but I'd also like to make it a bit more visible for you, how you might translate this into everyday doing. So I could tell lots of stories about big impressive businesses or military history or all sorts of things where improvisation crops up a lot. Paul Smith, who was quoted earlier, he works in a very improvisational way. And yet I'm not going to. I'm going to tell personal stories. But the reason I could tell lots of stories about different walks of life is because, in my view, this is actually how most things do get done. We tend not to ignore it. We rationalize it away and focus on the things that we can control and plan for. But an awful lot of the actual doing happens in this kind of creative, adaptive way. But I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. This is my house. I'm going to tell you two stories about the building of this house. And I assumed when we went into this project that we would be relying primarily on plans. The line there represents where the ground ought to have been. Down the ground, it moved. We got it wrong, and what we did was, instead of trying to shift the earth, instead of redoing where we'd staked out the land, this land slopes in two planes, we just stuck the garage underneath. So we turned what was a problem into an opportunity, put the garage underneath, and thus solved a problem. This is the view from my house. This is a Sierra de Gredos. And one day I was working on the scaffolding thinking, oh, it's a shame when this comes down, we won't be able to see this. So what we did was build a piece of raised garden, which is this bit inside the line, exactly where the scaffolding was. So just to notice, you can do two things with this looking at the world this way. You can solve problems with it by just flexing and adapting and using something in an unusual way. You can also create opportunities that you may not have seen through noticing more. So, I think those are 6 words, but you're having a lot of stuff thrown at you. And somebody was saying before this talk, gosh, got a lot of stuff here. So I'm going to get it down to 3. So here's your little do. Everything's an offer. So the idea of that is this is a core of the improv practice. It embraces all these 3 ideas. Improvisers constantly ask themselves this question: how can I take and use what's in front of me? Could be an error, could be a mistake, could be a shortcoming, could be something I have only just noticed. And they're always asking this relentlessly do-focused question, which is how can I take and use it? So it's very selfish. It's focused on your own goal, whatever it is you're doing or making. So this is something which is very quickly grasped and endlessly useful. So that's the little do. And sometimes you forget it. I forget it all the time and have to remind myself. But it's been helping me now for about 12, 15 years. And you don't have to do it instantly like people do on stage. You can stop and think. So allow yourselves a bit of time. For my big do, I want to introduce you to Igor. So this is Igor in a forest on the borders of Belarusia and Lithuania, just after an improv workshop. Igor, an interesting character. He was originally a Franciscan monk. He then became a Soviet fighter pilot before making the logical step into advertising. Now, he'd struggled with the improv workshop we'd done that day, and he came up to me and he said in his broken English, he said, "Me, Homo Sovieticus." I was a bit confused by this, and he went on, he said, "Addicted to control." And his feeling was that by being brought up in a centrally planned regime, he had just been kind of had this idea of controlling and planning everything just sort of fused into him, and he couldn't do anything else. And he may well have been right. But it struck me on reflection that actually we're all a bit like this, that we live in a society which for several hundred years now has really embraced the planning, predictive, analytical way of doing things. And so that's almost become our default setting. So for me, the big do, I guess what I'm trying to help people to do, is to break that control addiction. To not always try and nail it, to not always go back and plan, work harder, but to do something else instead. And I think that it's not that improv's the answer, but I think that what's magnificent about this way of working is it shows to you that you don't have to be in control in order to shape, influence, create, in order to make change. Improvisers do that all the time. They do it relentlessly. And they do it through this process of letting go, noticing more, using everything. It doesn't require a magic bullet or a new trick. The same old things practiced time and time again. Now, I don't think doing this big do is at all easy, either individually or collectively, because it requires humility to accept that we can't control things. And I think our society is still full of hubris rather than humility. I think it requires tolerance, because if you're not to try and control somebody else, another way of thinking, another way of doing, you have to accept that there is one that's different from yours. And it requires patience, because this is not a problem to be solved. This is not a plan to be implemented that will bring everything together in some magical way. This is, back to another strong theme of today, the ability to fail, fall down, get up, try again, and to be forgiving and compassionate with yourself whilst doing so. So the thing is, to me it seems worth it though, because if we can do this, if we can just let go of this a little bit and find a different way of working, then all around us there are all these magnificent, extraordinary, beautiful offers, as I would call them, that could unleash extraordinary change. And you know, here we are in a hotbed of them. And I think that's really worth tilting for, even if we have to give up something that's been very dear to us. Thank you very much.